The Torah begins, Bereshis bara Elokim. Bereshis bara, Eina mikra ze'omei ela darsheni. The pasuk, it's obvious, says it has to be expounded upon. It cannot be understood literally. Kamo shedoshu Rabbeinu, b'shvil Torah shnikus reishis, darko. The base reishis is for the sake of the chosen, or what's the choices. That's why God created existence. B'shvil Yisrael shnikru reishis to also. And for the sake of the Jewish people, are considered the first of the wheat, as the truma is the first of the wheat, which is given to the Kohen. That's the first tithing. The Jews themselves are the equivalent of the truma. Just as the truma, when you tithe it, it takes on a status of kedusha. Identically, the Jewish people, we are the first, the choicest of the totality. That's Bereshis bara Elokim. So the Torah, in the first three words already, is alluding what is the objective of creation. What's the purpose of all this existence? Torah's alluded to it. For the sake of Torah, which is Reishis, Darko, and for the sake of the Jewish people who are Reishis. That's bottom line. That's where it begins, that's where it ends. Now we have to flesh it out. But that's the objective. Passing while I'm thinking, there's an argument in the Gemara. What exactly was the Eitz Hadas? Adam was given a mitzvah. You can eat of all the trees of the garden, but one tree you're not permitted to eat of, the tree of knowledge, which its fruit is good and evil. Tov v'ra. Adam failed. Now, what was the Eitz Hadas? So one opinion in the Gemara, the Eitz Hadas was the grape, and we discussed it. And Reb Meir says it was the grape. Why? Because we find the Ben Sura Mora, the rebellious child, when he becomes 13 to 13 and a half, if he steals from his parents and he buys wine and meat, and he behaves in this gluttonous manner, which is an indication that he's developing an addiction, that ultimately he'll have to support a habit. If he becomes a repeated offender, he's warned by the court, he's going to be put to death. Except you have to make the many prerequisites, and the Gemara says it's not possible to meet all the prerequisites, but there's a takeaway. That's the Gemara, but it was the grape. So Ramesh says, how do we know it's the grape? So he explains, because we know that the majority of tragedies that come upon humanity in every society is alcoholism. People get drunk, and as a result of that, the behavior is totally irrational. The consequences of this, the ramifications of that irresponsible behavior is disastrous, family-wise, every-wise. Therefore, it makes sense to say that the fruit that brought the greatest tragedy on humanity, which we've been dealing with the issue till the coming Mashiach, was the grape. That's Reb Meir. Another opinion is it was the chita, it was the wheat. And the Gemara goes to explain, but it says eitz. A stalk of wheat is not a tree. So the Gemara cites psukim to show that wheat, it's referred to as eitz, that even though it's wheat. And the halach is, and the Gemara says in this halach in Shulchan Aruch, that a child, when does his mental development start developing in terms of any level of understanding? Usually when he's 6 weeks old, because then the child is able to be given wheat to eat, and that's the development of that aspect of the brain development when he's given wheat. And that's Eitz Hadas. The wheat gives you that ability, and therefore the Gemara tells us in Hurrius, that's why Pas Shachris is so crucial. Cited in Shulchan Aruch that a person should have wheat for breakfast. Pas Shachris, wheat bread. Because wheat somehow activates the mind in a way, gives us that ability to maximize on our intellect. It's Pas Shachris. It's wheat, but it's interesting. Wheat is the staple of life. Staple of life. Wheat is what was the Eitz Hadas. Wheat was the species of grain which actually took the world down. And Klal Yisrael, who are chosen to counter what that represents, Barasi Yitzhara, Barasi Torah Tavli. I've created the evil inclination. The only antidote to that evil inclination is what is the Torah. The Torah is Reishis Darko, is the choicest. Who are the Jewish people? We are the wheat. We have the ability to integrate that Torah into our being, to have that level of Kedusha. Despite the wheat itself is a representation of the good and the evil, we're able to extract the good of the evil and dominate the evil through that good, which is the Torah itself. But the Jews are compared to the choices of the wheat. Wheat, which is inferior, that wheat, you can't do anything. You can't separate the evil from that good. Therefore, the Gemara tells us in Shabbos, when we stood at Sinai, because the nations who were not there, the Jews were there, we were exposed to that most intensive level of God's presence. The impurity, the pollution of the snake was vaporized totally. It's called Poskezu Mosom. And we only had the traces of the Eitz Hadas, which is evil. Those traces of evil, which we have because we're descending from Adam, we're able to get the upper hand on it if we're spiritualized through the Torah. That's the Barsi Yitzhak. A non-Jew was not given the Torah because the non-Jew was not exposed to the level of Kedusha, and therefore he still has all the handicaps of the Eitz Hadas. Says the snake went and actually came upon Chava. He infused it with a level of evil, of spiritual pollution. So the non-Jew doesn't have the level of sensitivity that he has control to make choices that are demanded of a person to bring the world to perfection. Only the Jew, because that evil was vaporized, that spiritual pollution, we have the capacity to deal with all Torah mitzvahs at every level. And we have the capacity, we're given the tool. Could you imagine, given a weapon? It was known in Europe that if you were a Jew, you were drafted into the Polish army. The level of anti-Semitic Polish army was so extreme you couldn't survive, not only as a Jew, but even as a human being. So the yeshiva students, what they would do, it was known, people want to be exempted from the draft, they would cut off their trigger finger. The point they covered it, because if you don't have a trigger finger, that was an exemption. Could you imagine, give a person the best gun, he doesn't have a trigger finger, you can't shoot the gun. You give the nations of the world the Torah. It's the ultimate antidote to vanquish all evil, take control. But it's like not having the trigger finger. They don't have the capacity because they still have the pollution of the snake with the Eitz Hadas. They don't have the sensitivities, the capacity to make those choices, to use the Torah to bring the world to perfection. The clouds are the racist to us. Despite the fact that we are the wheat, and the wheat brought the world to a nation, because that's the Eitz Hadas, but we are the choices of the wheat. We are racist to us. We are the choices of that, and that wheat has relevance to Kedusha. Where do we see it? Because when you tie that wheat and you give it to the Kohen, what is it? It's innately holy. A person's a non-Kohen is not permitted to eat that wheat. If he eats it, what's the liability? It's koris. And why were the Kohanim? Why were they chosen to be the only ones qualified? Because they did not participate in the Chet HaEgel. Because when Moshe said, Mila Hashem Elai, Shevet Levi were the only ones. Not one of them violated idolatry. Before we were involved in the Egel, the Jews reverted back to pre-sin of Adam. The only ones who really held on, who remained initially where they should have been, we all should have been with Shevet Levi, except because they're part of Klal Yisrael, they reverted back to post-sin of Adam. But in terms of who they are, they have that kedusha. They have that specialness. As a result of that, the first of the wheat is given to them. They have the capacity to ingest that wheat, that level of holiness. The ordinary Jew does not. Therefore, because they dictate, we just had Yoram Shpechel Yaakov, Levi Yoram Shpechel Yaakov. There's Orach Chaim HaKodesh, and Zosa Brocha. Alan, it's important for you to know. It's a good Shalosh Shudas Torah. That the Orach Chaim HaKodesh says, Yisam Midabrosecho, you take a look at Orach Chaim and that posuk, Yisam Midabrosecho, he says over there that a non-Jew has the ability to convert and to become a full Jew. A full Jew. However, even if he becomes a full Jew and he's converted and he has the obligations of a Jew, but he says the Zuamo, the level of spiritual pollution, because he's not an original Jew, he still has difficulty contending with many issues. Because that's spiritual pollution. That's true. Even though it's difficult from the Gemara, because the Gemara says it's in Shabbos that every soul, every human being that ultimately is going to convert, that non-Jew soul is at Sinai. It's not only Jews' souls who are at Sinai, those who were not born yet into existence, but even the convert that eventually will convert to be a Jew, that person's neshama was also at Sinai. So that neshama was exposed to what? To that intense level of Hashem's presence. But yet he says, so you have to say, because in the physicality, the Zuama had to do with our physicality. And since the non-Jew does not descend from the physicality of a Jew, but from the physicality of a non-Jew, so part of this composite has something in it which is almost uncontendable. Therefore, he says, a non-Jew does not have the capacity to rise to the level of a Jew because he's still tainted with the Zuma, with the spiritual pollution of the Nachash and the Eitz Hadas. Take a look in the Orach Chaim HaKodesh over there. Here's the question.
Were the Leviim subjected to be part of the life that the current Jews have post the sin of the golden calf because they were in the environment or in the ecosystem with us?
Good question. I'd once had said, we find that the Gemara tells us that when the Jews said Nasiv Nishma at Sinai, Hashem had sent 600,000 angels and put a spiritual indication of distinction upon every Jew, 2 crowns. 1 crown for Naseh and 1 crown for Nishma. Nasiv and Nishma. Each Jew received 2 crowns. After the Chet Egel, Moshe Rabbeinu breaks the luchos and he says, Hashem says, Hose Ejim Meolecho. This distinction, this special spiritual distinction, you must forfeit it. You will forfeit it. And Hashem said 1,200,000 angels to remove each crown. So Tosa explains in Shabbos in Rabbi Akiva, which is the parak that discusses this Gemara, that when they were given the crowns, there were 600,000 angels. There were 600,000 men above the age of 20. Each angel gave each Jew 2 crowns. When it came to remove the crowns, he had to send 1,200,000 angels. One angel couldn't remove both crowns. When it came giving the crowns, one angel gave both crowns. The removal of the crown, the angel could only remove 1 crown, couldn't remove 2. So he had to send double the number of angels to remove the crowns. Why? So he explains, because when Hashem gives, he gives generously. Even when he has to take, and he take away from us, he shows it's with great difficulty. Therefore, he has to send twice as many angels to remove the spiritual distinctions, he had to send an additional 600,000 Malochim to remove it. That's what Tosfos explains over there. Now, what happened to all these crowns? These special levels of distinction, 1,200,000 crowns. Where did it go? So the Gemara says the beneficiary of these crowns was Moshe Rabbeinu. And the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu was Koren or Ponov, he radiated this holiness, it was as a result of the spiritual distinction of the whole Jewish people. He was the beneficiary of this. So I ask the question, if the Leviim did not participate in the Chet Egel, Mark's point, so if that's the case, and they're part of the Jewish people, that's where they forfeited the crowns. Moshe Rabbeinu was also part of the Jewish people. So why did he have the capacity to be the beneficiary of these crowns? He was a Jew like everyone else was. He was a more special Jew. So the Leviim were also special Jews. They did not participate in Chet Egel. So what I said was, this is on the similar, what Mark is saying, where was Moshe Rabbeinu when we did the Chet Egel? He was not in this realm of existence. He was in heaven. He was receiving the Torah in Shemayim. And Hashem says to him that what? Your people have become corrupted. You must go down. Your people have become corrupted. The Leviim were exposed to that. So because they were in that same environment, as much as they were opposed to whatever that was, because they were exposed to it, therefore they were affected. They were compromised. Moshe Rabbeinu was not exposed to it. As a result of that, therefore, he had the capacity to become the beneficiary of all those crowns, and that was the basis for his radiance. That's what I said at one time. However, what I said eventually, which I thought this is not the correct understanding, that whenever the Torah speaks about Kores, what is Kores? It's spiritual excision, which is the almost equivalent of that. Your relationship with God, you're excised from God. The word Kores means to cut. You cut off from God. But yet, you'll never find in the Torah ever saying, that soul is cut off from God. It always would say either me'ameho, from its people, or me'amo, or me'Yisrael. So I explained the Rambam rules that a person is a Porosh min hatzibur. Person separates himself from the Jewish people. Who is this person? He's a person who keeps the Torah in entirety, but he says the problem of the Jews are not his problem. They have their problems. The successes of the Jews are theirs. His success is his. He doesn't identify as a Jew, but yet he keeps the Torah in entirety. Evidently, he doesn't keep V'afta L'recha Kamocha. But everything else he keeps perfectly. Rambam says, Eilo Chet L'mabo. He has no share in the world to come. So the question is, but if he's such a perfect Jew, except he has this one shortcoming, why does he not have a share in the world to come? So I explained that an individual can only have, what's Olam Haba? Olam Haba is what? Is being exposed, a relationship with Hashem. That's what it is, as the Gemara tells us in Brochos. Tzaddikim biyoshvim, v'trosem b'roshem, v'nenim b'ziv hashchina. The tzaddikim, they sit with the crowns on their heads, and they benefit from the radiance of God's presence. They sit within his proximity, whatever that means, based on who you are, closer or further. It's a relation with God. Individuals don't have a relation with God. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they were the Merkava. They had a personal relationship with God. Where was the Shekhinah? Where they were. Once there's a Klal Yisrael, God only has a relationship with a nation. If you're part of that nation, you have a relationship with him. If you're not part of that nation, you have no relationship with him. As a result of that, the Torah tells us, you're cut off from the people. Once you're cut off from the people, you're not a part of the people, you have no relationship with God. Because God doesn't have relationships with individuals, only as part of the whole. So if a person's a Porosh min hatzibur, you say, I'm not part of the Jewish people. I do my own thing. I'll do my own thing perfectly, but not as part of them. Their successes are theirs, and my successes are mine. Their tragedies are theirs. I don't want to know about it. God said, if that's the case, we have no relationship. This is the concept. Okay? So therefore, as a result of that, the Levium are integral part. They're part of the Klaus. They're part of the Yud Beit Shvatim. They're the 12 tribes. Each tribe representing something else. So if that's the case, if God has no relation with individuals, Levi only exists as part of Klal Yisrael. So if the Jews are compromised and they have to forfeit those crowns, which has to do with their relation with God, being part of the whole, your relationship's also diminished. So they had to forfeit their crowns. So what about Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe Rabbeinu was Klal Yisrael. It says Moshe Rabbeinu Shokol Keneged Yisrael. He was the equivalent of the whole Klal Yisrael. As a result of that, he wasn't affected by them because he has a relationship directly with God because of who he was. His dimension of spirituality, his neshama, was such a neshama, he was Shokol Keneged Yisrael. And that's the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu was the only one who was qualified to receive the Torah at Sinai, because the Torah had to be given to the Jewish people. The medium through which it came was through the conduit was Moshe, because that had to be given to Klal Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu was the equivalent of Klal Yisrael. Being the equivalent of Klal Yisrael, the pass-through was Moshe Rabbeinu. Any other Jew is only a spoke in the wheel. He's not the totality. Moshe Rabbeinu was the totality. It's interesting. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin that Moshe Rabbeinu, what is the High Court of Israel? The Sanhedrin Gedolah, which convened in the Lishkas HaGozis in the Chamber of Cut Stone, with 70 judges. The Gemara says that Moshe Rabbeinu himself was the equivalent of 70. He's the equivalent of 70 judges. He in his own right, he's the totality of 70. What is 70? If you take a look, the Orach Chaim HaKodesh in Hazinu cites a Zohar that we find the 70 root nations. And we find that it says the nations are L'mispar B'nai Yisrael. It's the same number as the Jewish people, 70. Where were we, 70? We read in the Torah, when Yaakov went to Egypt, it says, B'shivim nefesh yordo Avosenu Mitzrayim. Our forefathers went to Egypt, there were 70 individuals, 70. So the 7, that's the Mitzvah of Yisrael. The 70 nations correspond to the Shivim Nefesh that went to Mitzrayim. And he goes over there based on the Zohar that if we are in where we should be, we dominate the world. We dominate the 70 nations. That's the 70 versus the 70. And that's really the tug of war between what we are and what the world is all about. That's the 70. He cites the Zohar. You have to look over there on that pasuk in the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. Moshe Rabbeinu was 70. He was the Sanhedrin Gedolah. That's the number 70. He's the totality, representing Emes. We speak about Emes Keneva al Timkor. What is the totality of Emes? That's 7. That's 70. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu was the equivalent of the Sanhedrin Gedolah. Moshe Rabbeinu was the equivalent of Klal Yisrael, which is the totality of Torah. Therefore, he was qualified, the only one qualified, to be the conduit to bring the Torah to Klal Yisrael. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu was not affected the way the rest of them were affected. Everyone is a spoke in the wheel. The wheel is compromised, every spoke is compromised. Moshe Rabbeinu is not that spoke. He's the equivalent of the totality of all of them. Therefore, he had the capacity to receive all those levels of distinction of holiness, and therefore that was the basis for his radiance. Every Shabbos we say, Yismach Moshe Mamnos Chelko. Ki Evanem Korosalo, right? That's the text of the Shachris. Moshe rejoices with his portion. Ki Evanem Korosalo. Orach Chaim HaKodesh explains, based on also the Zohar, every Shabbos a Jew gets a Neshama Yisera. We have enhanced, our soul becomes enhanced. And we lose it every Motzoi Shabbos. It comes Shabbos, we have it, Motzoi Shabbos, and that's what it says, Vayinofash. Vay Ovid Nefesh, the Gemara says. Woe that special spiritual distinction of every Jew is lost, and that's what we smell the Psalmim. Motzoi Shabbos is part of the Abdullah. It's like smelling salts. To be able to regain our equilibrium. That's the basis for the Besomim. Every Shabbos, every Jew gets back those levels of distinction are given back to every Jew. When we have the Neshama Yisera, that distinction of the Nasav and Nishma, those crowns are given back to every Jew. So what we're saying is, Yismach Moshe Matnas, although Moshe has all these special levels a whole week, and he gives it up every Shabbos, Yismach Moshe Matnas, he rejoices in his portion. His portion for him is enough. He's able to rejoice in his portion. Although it's not the equivalent to what he has all week, he's not, even though he's so-called diminished to a degree, because whatever he does it as a dedicated servant of Hashem. That's how he explains it over here. You take a look in the Orach Chaim HaKodesh.
Just back to Ernie's question for a moment. So when Moshe brings the Luchot down and destroys them in front of Klal Yisrael because of their sin, and then he makes an appeal, only Levium sign up for the Moshe program, so to speak. And so were the Jews, the rest of the Jews, just apathetic? I mean, I'm hard pressed to think if the whole notion of the creation of the calf was because they were seduced by the rabble into believing that Moshe had passed away.
Correct.
And then they see him, live and in person.
You know what it means? It says to kill even your father, your mother's husband, your brother who's only half brother through the maternal line. Right? We just said it in Zosah Baruch. That's who Levi was. The half brother that was related through the maternal side, if he was involved in the golden calf, he killed his brother. Meaning, family, there was no they themselves, there was no conflicts. They were so dedicated to God, there were no holdbacks. Every other Jew wasn't simple. Although you're paying, but to what degree are you willing to go? And that's why we find Levium, Shevet Levi, always the zealots of Klal Yisrael. Levi is the zealot. They have that characteristic to be a zealot with the purest intent. Mila Hashem Elai, whether it's Hanukkah, whether it's with many other things. And Pinchas was a Levi. But Kineas Kinosi, he avenged God's vengeance. He could not tolerate the Chil Hashem at all costs. When he went to die. He merited endless miracles that he survived it. And because he met the test of fire, although he's born a Levi, before his father was anointed to become the Kohen, he ascended to a level of Kohen, not because he was the son of Aaron, but rather because he was Kinos Kinosi, because he brought about the atonement for Klal Yisrael, the equivalent of a Kohen. Therefore, in his own right, he's worthy of the Kuna, of that special distinction. And this is the struggle. Who has the upper hand? But even when you have the upper hand, nobody had the upper hand the way the Avos HaKadoshim. They were the Merkava. They were the location of God's presence in this world, but yet we say Al Tamid Batzchat Yom Moscha. Hashem did not allow his name to be associated with them as long as they were alive. Because at the last moment, regardless of what you achieved, a person always has choice. And God forbid the last moment, you could always do a reversal. You understand? This is the ultimate chito, which is holy beyond holiness. But it still has that trace of the Rav, the Eitz Hadas. Therefore, you can't trust yourself. You can't rest on your laurels. As a Jew, never. We're always have to contend with the reality of our handicap. There's a defective gene in every one of us. That's the evil of the Eitz Hadas. But that's the staple of life. We ingest that bread, the wheat. What is the wheat? The wheat is the staple, but that's the reality of who we are. It's the composite of good and evil. The physical represents the evil. All inclinations to evil have to do with our physicality. The soul has no relevance to that. But that's the struggle. We spoke about the wine. That we say every kosher bracha is always on a cup of wine. Even according to Rameir, the grape was the Eitz Hadas. But yet when we sanctify Hashem's name, it's always Kiddush, Zachrei El Hayayim. Kosher bracha is always wine. Because that's what we have to contend with. We were chosen as Jewish people. We have the ability to utilize that in a context of Kedusha, as we utilize the wheat in the context of Kedusha. We're able to extract the good of from the evil and to make that discernment and not be affected by the negative, although it's a reality. You know, it's interesting. I once mentioned a Shalah Kodesh. Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, Lo ala lechem levadu yechya odom, ki al motzi pi Hashem yechya odom. Famous words of Moshe Rabbeinu telling Klal Yisrael, man does not live on bread alone, but on the word of God man lives. So the Shalah Kodesh explains it this way, that in every physical component, there are certain spiritual entities which are called Nitzotze Kedusha. When we eat bread, because he asks a question, it's not such a strong question, but the question he asks, bread is physical, so we understand it sustains our physicality. But seemingly, our soul also has to be sustained, has to be nourished. So you can say we're nourished with the mitzvahs. And as long as the body is sustained, is infused with nourishment, the soul remains attached to the body. He explains it this way. Man does not live on bread alone. But within the bread, this Pi Hashem, there are sparks of holiness that when you eat that bread, those sparks nourish the neshama. So it's not just the physicality of the bread, but it says, now it's interesting. So what is bread? The bread is the Eitz Hadas. The wheat, Tov v'Ra. When you eat that bread, we're being impacted on two levels. Our neshama is being impacted, and our physicality is being impacted. But when you eat that bread, you realize what happens. You're ingesting something which is representation of the evil of that Eitz Hadas. But the Jew, if you eat it l'shem shamayim, we're not affected by that, because that's Barasi Torah Tavlin. The Jew has the ability to get the upper hand and not be affected by it. Although we're ingesting that physicality, which contains it, it's like you have antibodies. The antibodies fight that bacteria. The same thing, the Kedusha within that, if you eat it the right mindset, you're able to somehow to subdue and suppress the negativity of what that represents. That's the Reishis Tuasa. So that's Lo Alechem Levadu Yechya Odom. It's our Motzi Pi Hashem. If we wouldn't have that Kedusha within that bread, we wouldn't stand a chance. It's just considered gluttonous behavior. You're feeding the devil. But since it has that component of Kedusha, therefore we're able to get a handle on it and take control of that.